June 6th, 1944. 016 hours. The Norman countryside sleeps beneath a canopy of stars, the air still holding the day's warmth mixed with the cool dampness rising from the hedgerows. In the scattered villages between Carentan and Sainte-Mère-Église, German sentries peer into the darkness, their breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. The channel churns somewhere beyond the cliffs, rhythmic and eternal. A farm dog barks once, then falls silent. The wind carries nothing but the scent of turned earth and wild roses tangled along ancient stone walls. Then, in that suspended moment between midnight and morning, the sky tears open. At first it is only a sound, distant, mechanical, a droning that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann, stationed at a machine gun nest overlooking a crossroads near Sainte-Mère-Église, tilts his head upward. The sound grows, swells, becomes a roar that drowns out thought itself, and then the darkness blooms with shapes, hundreds of them, thousands, parachutes unfurling like strange flowers against the star-pricked void, gliders descending in eerie silence between the thunder of C-47 engines. The sky is suddenly alive with falling men. Fallschirmjäger, someone whispers, the word catching in his throat. But these are not German paratroopers. These men descend in a torrent, a cascade that seems impossible in its scale. Hartmann's hands freeze on his weapon. In his 2 years defending Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, he has seen many things. Artillery barrages that turned forests to matchsticks, armor columns stretching to the horizon, the systematic machinery of total war. But this is something else entirely. Men falling from the heavens like a biblical plague, like judgment made manifest. The scale defies comprehension. Where are they all coming from? How many planes darken the sky above Normandy tonight? In those first stunned seconds before training and instinct drive German soldiers to their firing positions, there exists only awe, pure, unwilling awe. And beneath it, threading through the shock like ice water through veins, the first cold whisper of a question that will echo through the ranks in the days to come. What manner of nation can afford to throw men from the sky in such numbers? The German military mind, shaped by centuries of continental warfare and refined through the bitter lessons of the First World War, understood certain truths about combat to be immutable. Armies moved by rail and road. They concentrated force at decisive points through careful calculation and meticulous logistics. Vertical envelopment, dropping soldiers behind enemy lines by parachute, represented a tactical gambit, useful in specific circumstances, but necessarily limited by the sheer expense and complexity of aerial delivery. Germany's own airborne operations at Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium and during the invasion of Crete had been spectacular but costly. After Crete in 1941, where German paratroopers suffered such devastating casualties that Hitler essentially forbade further large-scale airborne operations, the lesson seemed clear. Paratroopers were shock troops, to be husbanded carefully, deployed with surgical precision. The Americans, it seemed, had not received this memo. On that June night, the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne Divisions, comprising over 13,000 men, dropped into Normandy. This followed months of strategic bombing that had seen American B-17s and B-24s darken European skies in formations so vast that German civilians below coined a new term, Wolkenkrieg, cloud war. But paratroopers were different. Each man represented not just a soldier, but an aircraft, specialized training, parachutes, reserve chutes, weapons containers, hundreds of pounds of equipment per individual. The mathematics were staggering, and yet here they came, wave after wave, the sky thick with them. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falli, commander of the German 91st Air Landing Division, had spent the evening of June 5th at a Kriegsspiel, a war game exercise in Rennes, gaming out theoretical responses to theoretical invasions. He was driving back to his command post in the early hours of June 6th when American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne began landing directly in his division's sector. His staff car ran into a patrol from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment near the hamlet of Les Mares de Benneville. Fally, a capable officer who had survived the Eastern Front, died in the initial exchange of gunfire. He never made it back to coordinate the defense he had theorized about hours earlier. The invasion he had planned for in abstract had quite literally fallen on top of him. For the German defenders scattered across Normandy, the night dissolved into chaos. Paratroopers landed in fields, in trees, on rooftops, in marshes deliberately flooded by Rommel's defensive preparations. They landed in villages and on lonely stretches of road. They landed among German positions and miles from their intended drop zones. But they kept landing. In the confusion and darkness, German units found themselves in firefights in a dozen places simultaneously, unable to determine the main thrust because there seemed to be no single thrust, only Americans everywhere. Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh, who would later achieve grim fame as the Beast of Omaha Beach for his defensive action at WN 62, spent the pre-dawn hours of June 6th not at his coastal position but racing through the Norman countryside with his unit, responding to reports of paratroopers, reports that came from every direction. They are behind us. They are in the village. They have taken the bridge. They are in the fields to the east. The reports contradicted each other, overlapped, created a picture of an enemy both omnipresent and impossible to fix in place. Severloh would later write in his memoir that the night felt less like combat and more like trying to fight smoke. Whenever his unit arrived at a reported landing zone, the Americans had either moved on, dug in so effectively they were invisible, or turned out to be in completely different numbers than intelligence suggested. Small groups fought like companies. The darkness swarmed with them. What the German soldiers could not fully grasp in those chaotic hours was that they were experiencing not merely a tactical operation, but the manifestation of an entirely different philosophy of war. The United States had entered the Second World War with an industrial capacity that dwarfed any other nation on Earth, and, crucially, that industrial base sat thousands of miles from enemy bombers, untouched and insulated. By 1944, American factories were producing an aircraft every 5 minutes. Every day, American shipyards launched more tonnage than the entire Kriegsmarine had possessed at the start of the war. This was war as mass production, logistics as ideology. The German defenders of Normandy had been told by their officers that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that any invasion would be thrown back into the sea, that German military prowess remained supreme. Many believed it. They had seen what German arms could accomplish. The conquest of Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, the Balkans in days. They had watched Wehrmacht newsreels showing columns of panzers rolling across steppes under endless skies. They had been taught that German discipline, German tactical excellence, German-Prussian military tradition represented the pinnacle of military science, and then men fell from the sky in numbers that made a mockery of scarcity. Lieutenant Gustav Knittel, commanding a platoon of the 709th Infantry Division near Utah Beach, had fought in Poland and France. He considered himself a veteran, hardened to the surprises of combat. He had expected, on some level, that an Allied invasion would come. He had not expected to spend the night of June 5th or 6th watching an endless stream of transport planes pass overhead, their formations so dense they seemed to create a ceiling above Normandy, a second sky of aluminum and fabric. In a letter to his wife written 2 weeks later, one of the last he would write before being killed in the fighting around Cherbourg, Knittel tried to describe what he had witnessed. "We shot at them, of course. We fired everything we had into the sky. Some planes caught fire. Some paratroopers hung dead in their harnesses as they descended. But they kept coming, Elizabeth. They kept coming as if our bullets meant nothing, as if losses meant nothing. I have seen Russian attacks where men advanced in waves, and we cut them down, and more came, and we cut those down too, until finally they retreated or we ran out of ammunition. This was like that, but from above. And they did not retreat. How many men does America have? How many planes? In France, when we invaded, we calculated every platoon, every liter of fuel. These Americans seem to calculate nothing. They simply come." Knittel's letter, preserved in family archives and later published in a collection of soldier correspondence, captures something essential. the psychological weight of facing an enemy for whom material seemed infinite. The paratroopers themselves were formidable, well-trained, aggressive, innovative, but beyond their individual capabilities, they represented something more unsettling. They represented surplus. America could afford to throw men from airplanes. America could afford to scatter an entire division across the countryside, accepting that many would land in the wrong place, that some would die before they hit the ground, that equipment would be lost, that the operation would be, by German standards of precision, chaotic. America could afford chaos because America could afford the material to compensate for chaos. The symbolism was not lost on the German soldiers who survived that night and the brutal campaign that followed. Among the items recovered from dead and captured American paratroopers were the contents of their pockets and packs. German intelligence officers cataloged these items with increasing bewilderment. Cigarettes, not the ersatz tobacco that German soldiers had long since become accustomed to, made from whatever could be dried and rolled, but real American cigarettes, Lucky Strikes and Camels, packed in perfect cardboard boxes. Chocolate, not the thin, gritty rations that Wehrmacht quartermasters distributed sparingly, but thick Hershey bars, rich and sweet. Chewing gum, that peculiar American habit, sticks of it wrapped in foil. Instant coffee, another American innovation, packets of it that needed only hot water. These were not the supplies of an army at the end of a tenuous supply chain. These were the supplies of an army for whom abundance was assumed. Stabsgefreiter Paul Kruger, captured by the 101st Airborne near Carentan in mid-June, later described his first meal as a prisoner of war. He had expected, based on German propaganda about the decadent and weakened Allies, to be treated harshly, to receive minimal rations, to be subjected to the privations that accompanied defeat. Instead, he was given white bread, which he had not seen since before the war. Butter, coffee, and a cigarette. The American soldier guarding him, barely 20 years old, with a soft drawl that Kruger later learned was from a place called Tennessee, offered him half a chocolate bar through the barbed wire. "I did not understand," Kruger recalled in a 1970s interview for a German television documentary on the Normandy campaign. "I had been taught that America was a mongrel nation, soft from luxury, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice that warfare demanded. And yet these men had jumped from airplanes in the middle of the night into occupied France. They fought like devils, and then they gave me chocolate. Real chocolate. Not because they pitied me personally, I think, but because they had so much of it. The guard ate the other half while watching me, casual, as if such things were normal. As if jumping from planes and having chocolate to spare were both normal. That is when I began to understand that we had perhaps made a very great mistake about what kind of enemy we were fighting. The chocolate, the cigarettes, the coffee. These items became symbolic of a larger reality that German soldiers confronted in Normandy and then across France and into Germany itself. The Americans were not merely materially superior in terms of tanks and planes and ships. They were materially superior in every dimension, down to the individual soldier's pocket. A Wehrmacht soldier in 1944 received approximately 2,500 calories per day in rations when supply lines were functioning well, less when they were disrupted. An American soldier's ration scale exceeded 4,000 calories per day. German tank crews often went into battle having slept poorly and eaten poorly, their panzers rationed for fuel. American tank crews stopped to brew coffee using gasoline from their virtually unlimited fuel supplies, ate hot food prepared by dedicated mess units in the rear, and received mail from home with a regularity that seemed almost supernatural to their opponents. This was abundance as weapon. This was logistics as ideology made manifest. But it was the paratroopers specifically, those men who had fallen from the sky, who became the most vivid symbol of this abundance. To deploy airborne forces on the scale that America deployed them required not just wealth, but a particular kind of strategic confidence. It required the certainty that losses could be absorbed, that if an operation went wrong, the entire capability would not be squandered. It required fundamentally the ability to treat soldiers as renewable resources within a production system. This sounds cold when stated so bluntly, and it was. War is cold. But there was something uniquely American in the calculation. German military philosophy, shaped by Clausewitz and Moltke and the general staff tradition, emphasized the qualitative: better training, superior tactics, the decisive battle, the knockout blow. American military philosophy, shaped by the Civil War and industrialization and a continent's worth of resources, emphasized the quantitative: more of everything, everywhere, simultaneously, until the enemy's ability to resist collapsed not through tactical defeat, but through systemic exhaustion. The paratroopers embodied this. They were elite troops, yes, volunteers who had passed through rigorous training, men who represented the best the U.S. Army could produce. But America deployed them not as a scalpel, but as a hammer. 13,000 men on D-Day, another 8,000 in Operation Market Garden 3 months later. Thousands more in southern France, in the Philippines, in crossing the Rhine. Where Germany had learned from Crete that airborne operations were too costly, too risky, America had learned from Normandy that airborne operations were effective precisely because they could afford to absorb the chaos and the casualties. Oberleutnant Martin Poppel, a veteran of the German Fallschirmjäger, the paratroops, who spent the latter part of the war fighting as regular infantry on the Western Front, wrote extensively in his diary about the psychological impact of facing American airborne forces. Poppel had jumped into Poland, Norway, Crete. He understood the unique terror of vertical assault, but he also understood the limitations, the careful planning required, the knowledge that each operation might be the last if it went badly. The Americans dropped their paratroopers like we drop propaganda leaflets, he wrote in August 1944 after hearing reports from Normandy. With that same carelessness, that same assumption of plenty, we dropped propaganda because paper and ink were cheap and soldiers' lives were precious. The Americans seem to have decided that both are cheap, or rather, that they have enough of both that the distinction does not matter. This is a terrifying way to think about war. It means they cannot lose, not through any tactical brilliance or superior fighting spirit, but simply because they can continue longer than anyone can resist them. Poppel survived the war, barely, and his diaries, published decades later, provide a unique perspective. The viewpoint of a German paratrooper confronting the American interpretation of what airborne warfare could be. Where German doctrine had evolved toward caution, American doctrine had evolved toward overwhelming commitment. Where Germany saw its paratroopers as too valuable to risk, America saw its paratroopers as valuable enough to use. The transformation in German perception occurred not in a single moment, but across the slow, grinding months from June to December 1944. Normandy was followed by the breakout, the race across France, Market Garden, the approach to the Rhine. At each stage, German soldiers encountered the same phenomenon: American material superiority that seemed to border on the supernatural. Convoys of trucks stretching for miles, artillery barrages that turned entire grid squares into moonscapes. Air superiority so complete that Luftwaffe pilots called any daytime flight mission a suicide run. But it was the personal encounters, the small moments, that often carried the most psychological weight. Gefreiter Otto Fischer, captured during the Bulge offensive in December, described being processed through the American rear area. What struck him was not the efficiency or the organization, though both were impressive. What struck him was that the Americans had brought a mobile ice cream production unit, a factory on wheels that produced ice cream for frontline troops. Ice cream, in December, in Belgium, while fighting was ongoing 20 miles away. I laughed when I saw it, Fischer recalled. I thought it must be a hallucination. I had been eating snow and frozen potatoes for weeks. We were told that our offensive would succeed because the Americans were soft, because they could not endure hardship. And here they were, in winter, in combat, eating ice cream, not because they needed it, but because they could, because their logistics system was so robust that they could afford to transport the machinery and ingredients and fuel necessary to produce frozen desserts at the front. I stopped laughing quickly, because if they could do that, if they could spare the ships and trucks and fuel for ice cream, what else could they bring to bear? How do you fight an enemy who treats ice cream as a frontline necessity? The ice cream, like the chocolate and the cigarettes and the paratroopers falling from the sky, became a symbol. It represented not just material abundance, but a fundamental philosophical difference about what war required. The German military had spent 5 years learning to do more with less, to husband resources, to jury-rig repairs, to extract maximum efficiency from every liter of fuel and every round of ammunition. The American military had spent 5 years learning to do more with more, to overwhelm problems through the application of resources, to treat logistics as the central challenge of warfare rather than a supporting element. This was not entirely an American innovation. Napoleon had famously remarked that an army marches on its stomach, that logistics determined strategy. But America had industrialized Napoleon's insight, had turned the observation into a system of such scale that it transformed the character of warfare itself. The German military was excellent at tactics, at operational art, at training individual soldiers and small units to a high standard. But by 1944, tactics mattered less than factories, training mattered less than throughput, excellence mattered less than volume. Among the German soldiers who encountered American paratroopers in Normandy, certain phrases began to circulate, repeated in letters home, in diaries, in conversations between men huddled in foxholes. Sie kamen aus dem Nichts. They came from nowhere. Der Himmel war voller Feinde. The sky was full of enemies, wie ein Schwarm Heuschrecken, like a swarm of locusts. The biblical imagery was telling. This was a plague, a force of nature, something beyond normal military comprehension. Lieutenant Werner Kortenhaus, who survived the fighting around Sainte-Mère-Église and later wrote a memoir, described the experience of defending the town in those early hours. American paratroopers had landed directly in the town square, on church roofs, in the streets. Many were killed immediately, shot as they descended, or killed upon landing. But others landed on the outskirts, grouped together, began advancing. Kortenhaus's company fought them house to house, room to room. The Americans were aggressive, willing to take casualties, and seemingly inexhaustible. We killed many of them, Kortenhaus wrote, but in the morning there were more. We captured some, and American bombers came and destroyed our positions, and there were more paratroopers. Where did they come from? We had intelligence reports, we knew about the airborne divisions, but knowing numbers on paper is different from seeing them, from fighting them, from having them come at you again and again, and understanding that they are only the first wave, that behind them is an entire ocean of more Americans, more equipment, more of everything. The psychological warfare was unintentional, but devastating. American planners had chosen airborne assault for tactical reasons, to secure bridges, disrupt communications, create chaos in German rear areas. But the effect was also symbolic, a demonstration of American capability that corroded German morale more effectively than propaganda ever could. Propaganda could be dismissed as lies. The evidence of your own eyes, of paratroopers descending in numbers that defied economy, could not be dismissed. Hauptmann Wilhelm Wiebig, a staff officer with the 352nd Infantry Division, was responsible for compiling after-action reports in the weeks following D-Day. His reports, preserved in German military archives, make for sobering reading. They catalog, in precise military language, the mounting realization that the invasion could not be stopped, but interspersed with tactical assessments are observations about enemy capability that read almost like philosophical reflections. In one report dated June 15th, Wiebig wrote, "The enemy does not seem to feel the losses that would cause any other army to pause and consolidate. Their airborne forces continue to operate aggressively despite having suffered what our intelligence estimates as 30% casualties during the initial drop. This suggests either fanaticism or a depth of reserves that makes casualties irrelevant to operational planning." Intelligence leans toward the latter interpretation. If accurate, this has profound implications for our defensive strategy. How does one defend against an enemy who can afford to lose thousands of men in a single night and consider it an acceptable opening move? Wiebig's question would echo through the remaining 11 months of the European war. How do you fight abundance? How do you defeat an enemy for whom every resource you lack, fuel, food, ammunition, vehicles, men, exists in such quantity that waste is acceptable? There is a peculiar poignancy in reading the words of German soldiers from mid-1944 onward. Many were not fanatics. Many were not even committed Nazis if they ever had been. They were men who had been caught up in the machinery of total war, conscripted or enlisted young, sent to defend positions they increasingly understood could not be defended. They fought because their comrades fought, because their homes were behind them, because surrender felt like betrayal, even as defeat became inevitable. And in their private writings, in letters that made it past censors or diaries kept hidden, there emerges a common thread, a grudging respect for American material capability that gradually transformed into a deeper understanding that they were not fighting an army but an industrial system, not a nation but an ideology of abundance made kinetic. Obergefreiter Franz Gockel, serving with a Panzer Grenadier unit that faced American forces across the French countryside in July and August, kept a detailed diary that survived the war. His entries from early July focus on tactical matters, ground held, ground lost, casualties inflicted and suffered. But by mid-August, as his unit retreated toward the German border, the entries change in character. On August 18th, he wrote, "Today we captured 2 American soldiers from the 82nd Airborne. They had been cut off from their unit for 3 days. They were still well fed. They still had ammunition. One of them had a photograph of his girlfriend and a package of chewing gum. They did not seem particularly worried about being captured. The older one, he must have been all of 23, spoke some German, learned from his grandmother who came from Heidelberg. He asked if we had any food to spare. When we gave him black bread and ersatz coffee, he seemed surprised at how poor it was. 'You guys been eating this the whole war?' he asked. I did not know how to explain that yes, we have been eating this and worse, and that his surprise at our rations is more demoralizing than his rifle ever was. How can we win a war against a nation whose soldiers expect good food as a basic right?" The chewing gum appears repeatedly in German accounts. It was a small thing, meaningless in tactical terms, but its ubiquity among American soldiers, the casual way they chewed it while fighting, while guarding prisoners, while advancing, it became a symbol of the same abundance the paratroopers represented. America made war while chewing gum. America dropped men from the sky, and those men carried chocolate. America fought a total war across 2 oceans and still had ice cream. For German soldiers raised in a nation that had known economic privation since the Treaty of Versailles, that had experienced hyperinflation and depression, that had been fed propaganda about autarky and living space, and the need to conquer resources that other nations hoarded. For these soldiers, encountering American abundance was cognitively destabilizing. Everything they had been told about why Germany needed to fight, about the world being a zero-sum competition for scarce resources, was implicitly challenged by every American they encountered. The symbolism of men falling from the sky carried a particular resonance that extended beyond the purely military. In mythology and religion, beings that descend from above are divine or demonic, angels or demons, heralds of change. The German language contains the word Fallschirmjäger, but it also contains older words, Himmelsstürmer, those who storm heaven, a term from the peasant revolts of the 16th century. There was something primal about the image of warriors descending from above, something that bypassed rational military assessment and struck at a deeper psychological level. Pastor Heinrich Gruber, a Protestant minister who spent time in concentration camps for helping Jews escape and who lived through the Normandy invasion in a small town near the coast, wrote in his journal about the night of June 5th or 6th. Gruber was no friend of the Nazi regime, but he was German, and he recorded his reactions with the honesty of a man who believed he was writing for God rather than for posterity. "They came from the sky like the plague of Egypt," he wrote. "The soldiers in our town ran about in confusion, shouting orders that contradicted each other. I stood in the churchyard and watched the parachutes bloom against the darkness, hundreds upon hundreds, and I thought of Exodus, of the frogs and the locusts and the darkness that could be felt. Is this judgment? Has God sent these men from across the sea to bring judgment upon us for what we have done, for what we have allowed to be done? The soldiers see only an invasion. I see the hand of a power greater than any army. These Americans with their machines and their wealth, they are the instrument of something larger. We sowed the wind. Now comes the whirlwind descending from above. Gruber's theological interpretation was his own, but the sense of facing something larger than a conventional military force was widely shared. The scale of the American effort, the planes, the ships, the men, the material, represented not just industrial capacity, but a kind of national will that German propaganda had insisted did not exist in the decadent democracies. America was supposed to be too divided, too soft, too individualistic to fight effectively. The paratroopers falling into Normandy gave the lie to that comfortable narrative. These men had volunteered for the most dangerous form of combat. These men represented a democracy that could marshal resources and commitment equal to or exceeding any totalitarian state. This was, in its way, the most devastating blow to the ideological foundations of National Socialism. The Nazi worldview rested on certain assumptions about racial hierarchy, about the superiority of disciplined German militarism over decadent democratic capitalism. But here came American capitalism, industrial and militant, dropping soldiers from the sky in numbers that suggested discipline and organization on a scale Germany could not match. Here came democracy, diverse and polyglot. The 82nd and 101st Airborne contained men whose ancestors came from Italy, Poland, Ireland, Germany itself, Africa, Mexico, and these men fought with a cohesion and effectiveness that made a mockery of racial theories about military capability. The transformation in German perception was not universal or complete. Until the end, some fought with fanatical determination. Some believed in final victory, in wonder weapons that would turn the tide, in the righteousness of their cause. But among the common soldiers, among the men who actually faced American forces in the field, the months after Normandy saw a gradual collapse of confidence that began, for many, with that night when the sky opened and men fell like rain. Feldwebel Albert Frey, who survived the war and later became a schoolteacher in Hamburg, gave an interview in 1984 for a local history project about German veterans' experiences. Asked about the turning point when he personally knew Germany would lose, he did not cite Stalingrad or Kursk or the strategic bombing campaign. He cited Normandy, specifically the night drop. "I was not in Normandy on D-Day," Frey said. "I was in Belgium, in reserve. But men from units that had been there came through our position in mid-June, retreating, reorganizing. I asked them what it was like, and one man I remember, he was an older soldier, a veteran of Poland and France. He had an Iron Cross. He was not a coward or a defeatist. He looked at me and said, 'The Americans came out of the sky. Thousands of them. We shot hundreds, and there were still thousands. And then the ships came, and there were more. And then the tanks came, and there were more. They have more of everything, and we have less of everything, and that is the entire war. Everything else is details.' That stayed with me. The simplicity of it. They have more. We have less. When he said it, I knew we would lose. It was just a matter of time." The mathematics were indeed simple once you faced them honestly. America, in 1944, possessed approximately 40% of the world's total manufacturing capacity. The United States produced more steel, more oil, more electricity, more of every industrial input than all of Axis powers combined. American farms fed not only American soldiers, but British and Soviet forces as well through Lend-Lease. The Atlantic, which Hitler had hoped would protect America and keep it isolated from European affairs, had instead become a highway across which poured an endless stream of men and material. And the paratroopers, falling into Normandy, were the visible manifestation of this imbalance made kinetic. Each C-47 transport plane that carried them represented aluminum and rubber and electronics. Each parachute represented silk or nylon, high-grade fabric that most Germans had not seen in years. Each soldier represented food and training and equipment far exceeding what Germany could provide its own forces. Multiply that by 13,000 men, by the planes that carried them, by the ships that supported the invasion, by the factories that produced everything, and the scale became cosmic. There is a photograph taken by an American combat photographer on June 7, 1944, that captures something essential about the German experience of facing American airborne forces. It shows a German prisoner, young, perhaps 19, sitting on the ground with his hands behind his head. Behind him stands an American paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, offering the prisoner a cigarette. The German is looking up at the American with an expression that is not quite fear, not quite gratitude, but something more complex, a kind of baffled reassessment. In the background, a knocked-out German pillbox smolders. The ground is torn up from shell fire. But the American is offering a cigarette, and the gesture is casual, easy, the gesture of someone who has cigarettes to spare, who assumes that abundance is normal. This photograph circulated in German papers after the war, printed in magazines that grappled with how Germany had lost, with what had gone wrong. Captions varied, but they all gestured toward the same observation. That material power, deployed with strategic purpose, had proved decisive. That the vaunted German military, for all its tactical prowess and fighting spirit, had lost not because German soldiers were inferior, but because they were systematically outproduced, outshipped, outgunned, outfed. The paratroopers became emblematic of this. They were not better soldiers, necessarily, than German Fallschirmjäger. Man for man, German paratroopers had proved themselves in combat across multiple theaters. But German paratroopers existed in limited numbers, deployed with care, husbanded like the scarce resource they were. American paratroopers existed in such numbers that they could be dropped in division strength, accepted high casualties, absorbed the chaos of scattered drops, and still accomplish their objectives through sheer persistence and abundance. This was the lesson of Normandy, taught by men falling from the sky, that in modern industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own, that logistics matter more than valor, that an army supplied by the greatest industrial base in human history cannot be defeated by tactics alone, no matter how excellent those tactics might be. As the war ground toward its conclusion, as Germany was occupied and divided, as the full scope of Nazi crimes became public knowledge, and German soldiers and civilians grappled with shame and complicity, the memory of American paratroopers falling into Normandy took on additional layers of meaning. For some, it became a symbol of liberation, the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime. For others, it remained a military memory, a moment when the tide turned irrevocably. But for many German veterans, especially those who fought in the West, the paratroopers represented something more subtle and enduring, the moment when the world revealed itself to be larger, richer, and more powerful than German propaganda had allowed them to believe. The sound of C-47 engines, the image of parachutes blooming against darkness, the casual abundance of American material, these memories persisted. They were told and retold in veteran gatherings, in interviews, in memoirs written decades later. And embedded in these retellings was an implicit acknowledgement that Germany had misjudged not just American military capability, but the nature of American society itself. The United States was not weak because it was democratic. It was powerful because it was democratic, because its economic system generated wealth on a scale that could be mobilized for total war, because its diverse population could be integrated into effective military units, because its political system, for all its flaws, commanded enough legitimacy that millions volunteered to fight. The paratroopers falling into Normandy were not just soldiers. They were ambassadors of a different way of organizing society, one that proved in the crucible of history's largest and most destructive war to be more effective at mobilizing human and material resources than fascism. This was the deepest transformation in perception, the one that took longest to fully accept, that the Nazi worldview had been not just morally monstrous, but factually wrong about how power worked in the modern world. Totalitarian control did not produce superior industrial output. Racial theories did not predict military effectiveness. Autarky and conquest were less efficient at generating resources than trade and production. The Americans proved this by example, by showing up with more of everything, by dropping men from the sky in numbers that made scarcity obsolete as a planning factor. Decades after the war, German historians would analyze the Normandy invasion with the clarity of hindsight and access to archives from both sides. They would note that the airborne drop, while achieving important tactical objectives, had been costly and chaotic, that many paratroopers landed far from their objectives, that casualties were higher than anticipated. From a narrow military perspective, the operation had serious flaws. But the German soldiers who experienced that night in June 1944 did not have access to after-action reports or casualty figures. They had only their direct experience of an enemy who could afford to be chaotic, who could absorb high casualties and continue operating, who dropped thousands of men from the sky because they could. The psychological impact of that experience outweighed the tactical details. There is a concept in warfare of shock and awe, using overwhelming force and spectacular displays of power to paralyze enemy decision-making and destroy the will to fight. The American airborne drop in Normandy accomplished this, not through any single decisive engagement, but through the cumulative weight of demonstration. The message received by German forces was clear. You are facing an enemy with resources so vast that they can afford operations you would never attempt. Every time you kill 10 of them, 100 more will come. Every defensive position you prepare will be bypassed or overwhelmed. Every calculation you make about how much material an army requires, they exceed. This was psychological warfare at the strategic level, conducted not through propaganda, but through the simple fact of showing up with 12,000 paratroopers and the aircraft to deliver them. In the final analysis, what German soldiers said when American paratroopers seemed to drop out of nowhere varied from individual to individual: shock, fear, admiration, disbelief, resignation. But beneath the variety of immediate reactions, a common thread emerged in the months and years that followed. A recognition that they had been fighting not just an army but an industrial system, not just soldiers but the embodiment of abundance as strategy. The paratroopers became a symbol because they made abstract economic power concrete. You could see them descending, count them, fight them, and in fighting them understand that behind each one stood a factory, a farm, a society organized for production on a scale Germany could not match. The chocolate they carried, the cigarettes they shared with prisoners, the ice cream waiting in the rear areas, these were not mere luxuries, but symptoms of systemic difference. America had waged war as it waged peace, with surplus, with waste, with the assumption that more was always available. This was not moral superiority. War is not moral, but it was effective superiority, and in total war, effectiveness is what determines outcomes. The sky over Normandy, thick with parachutes on the night of June 5-6, 1944, told a story about the nature of power in the industrial age. It was a story about logistics and manufacturing, about democratic capitalism's capacity for mobilization, about the advantages of being a continental nation protected by oceans and blessed with resources. It was a story told in aluminum and silk and chocolate, in the roar of engines and the bloom of parachutes, in the stunned expressions of German soldiers watching men fall from the sky in numbers that defied economy. And it was a story that, once told, could not be forgotten. The paratroopers fell like rain, like judgment, like the future descending into a past that had misjudged the nature of the world. They fell bearing weapons and rations and cigarettes, ambassadors of a power that measured its strength not in the quality of individual soldiers or the brilliance of tactics, but in the simple, overwhelming arithmetic of more. More men, more planes, more supplies, more of everything. In the face of such abundance, deployed with strategic purpose, what could German soldiers say? They fought because soldiers fight. They resisted because armies resist. But in their private thoughts, in their letters home, in their diaries and post-war reflections, they acknowledged a truth that propaganda could not counter. They were watching the future defeat the past, watching democracy prove itself more terrible in war than dictatorship, watching the sky open and pour forth an America they had not imagined possible. The paratroopers fell, and with them fell the last illusions about how the war would end. After that night, everything else was epilogue, brutal, costly, necessary, but ultimately inevitable. The sky had spoken, the harvest had begun,